Thank you, Ray, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to be discussing CDER's review of the prescribing information. So FDA approves several different types of labeling. As Lubna mentioned earlier, there's the carton and container labeling, there's medication guides, there's patient package inserts. I'm going to be focusing on the prescribing information, which used to be called the package insert, actually. And the prescribing information is written for and directed to healthcare providers and not patients. There are specific types of labeling, such as medication guides and patient package inserts, that are directed to patients, but the prescribing information really is just for the healthcare provider. Many of the principles that I'll be discussing about how we review labeling can also be used by applicants in developing labeling. So our learning objectives for this session are to understand the regulatory requirements for the prescribing information, the roles and responsibilities of some CDER staff and how we review the prescribing information, the importance of clear, concise, and applicable information in the prescribing information, the content of some recently published labeling guidances, and where to find resources for developing the prescribing information. So our main goal when we review labeling is to ensure that the labeling meets statutory requirements and is appropriately consistent with guidance recommendations. We also really want to make sure that the labeling at the end of the day is clinically meaningful and scientifically accurate, is concise and clear for healthcare providers. Because at the end of the day, prescription drug labeling is really FDA's primary communication tool for disseminating information about prescription drug labeling. In fact, when we train internally, we tell reviewers, your review is very important, but at the end of the day, how we communicate that information to stakeholders is maybe even more important. So from a labeling perspective, we obviously think labeling is important. We think communication is important. And we think words are important. But words are important for everybody in any context, as I'm going to exemplify in the next slide. Words are powerful. This is Marie Antoinette. As you may recall, Marie was from Austria and married Louis XVI. She was Queen of France right before the French Revolution. Marie lived a lavish life, obviously, as Queen of France. But when she found out that the peasants had no bread, she apparently said, "Let them eat cake." Well, this did not go over well with the French people. And this term began to symbolize the dislike that the people had for the monarchy. And as you may recall, this fueled the fire, and what ended up happening was the French Revolution, and Marie lost her head, literally. Many historians now think, however, that Marie may not have actually said, "Let them eat cake." This may have been said by another queen of France who lived 100 years before, or may not have been said at all by Marie. But actually, what's interesting is Marie couldn't have said, "Let them eat cake," because the French translation is actually, "Let them eat brioche." And a brioche is a sweet French roll. So I think we would all agree that from an English language perspective, "Let them eat cake" is probably a lot more powerful than "Let them eat brioche," but that may be a more level-headed statement. I don't know. So words can be misinterpreted. So "let's eat grandma" has a very different meaning than "let's eat grandma." So in this case, the comma can be life-saving. So now that we're all on the same page, we all understand how important words are in communication let's talk more about the prescribing information. So based on our regulations, the prescribing information must contain a summary of the essential information needed for the safe and effective use of the drug, must be informative and accurate, must not be promotional in tone, must not be false or misleading, must be updated when new information becomes available that causes the labeling to become inaccurate, false, or misleading, and must be based whenever possible on human data. So there's two formats for the prescribing information. There's the prescription labeling rule, or PLR format, and then there's non-PLR format. Since all recently approved labeling must be in PLR format, that will be the focus of my presentation. And for PLR formatted labeling, there are three main sections. There's the highlights of prescribing information, called highlights, the table of contents, called contents, and the full prescribing information, or the FPI. Although this is the order in which the information is presented in the prescribing information, this is usually not the order in which we review the information. CDER usually starts the review of the prescribing information with the full prescribing information because this section populates the other two, highlights and contents. And on this slide, you can see all the required sections and subsections of the prescribing information. Additional subsections could be added, most commonly, for instance, warnings and precautions or drug interactions. However, we recommend when you add new subsections that information is presented in a clinically meaningful way and in an order of clinical importance. For instance, 5.1 would be more clinically important information than 5.11. This is contents, and contents is populated based on the information in the full prescribing information. Sections or subsections that are required are omitted if they're clearly inapplicable or could be misleading. However, if a required section or subsection is omitted, the numbering remains the same. Therefore, for instance, section 11 is always description, even if section 10, overdosage, is omitted. The purpose of highlights is to provide quick access for prescribers to the information that they most commonly refer to and is most important for them to prescribe in prescribing to their patients. So highlights is based on the full prescribing information. It's a summary of just some of the essential content, however, of the full prescribing information, and must only be 1/2 page in length unless a waiver is granted. So a lot of our time in reviewing highlights is trying to make it more concise and reader-friendly. So some of the things we use in doing this are, for instance, we use phrases as opposed to full sentences. We'll avoid redundancy by placing information only under one heading, if applicable. We also use tables and bullets. And we also very commonly will not include all the information from the full prescribing information and omit information that may be less important. For instance, not all warnings and precautions or drug interactions that are listed in the full prescribing information necessarily need to be included in highlights. So when we review the prescribing information, it's a collaborative approach. There's a lot of reviewers who are involved. When we talk to industry, they sometimes feel like this is a black box. I'm not quite sure how we do this. So I'm going to give you an example of how we collaborate in reviewing the prescribing information. And generally, there's core reviewers, and then there's adjunctive reviewers. I'm going to list some of them, but there are many others who could be involved in the application and labeling based on what type of product it is. So the reviewers could definitely will include the office or division director, deputy director. These act as the signature authority. They're the ones who sign the approval letters for which the approved labeling is attached. You heard yesterday a little bit about the CDTL, the cross-discipline team leader. This, from a labeling perspective, this person oversees the multidiscipline review of the prescribing information to be sure that it's scientifically accurate and clinically meaningful. So at the end of the day, even though we want every section of the prescribing information, even subsections and sections that may not seem quite as clinical, such as non-clinical toxicology, to be clinically meaningful because, again, our end users are healthcare providers. So the CDTL always looks at the entire labeling for all the sections. The regulatory project manager, you heard yesterday about their various roles. They're certainly very involved in the review of the prescribing information. They perform and manage administrative functions. So they will set timelines. They will schedule meetings, for example. They will communicate with the applicant and manage communications within CDER. Another very important role they have is version control of the prescribing information. As you can imagine, if you have 10 different people reviewing the same labeling at once, version control is very critical. They also perform a format review of the prescribing information called the Selected Requirements of Prescribing Information, which we call the SERP. I'm going to discuss this a little bit later. This is performed in the filing period. A rather newer role we have is the Associate Directors for Labeling. These are labeling specialists within the division. So they ensure that the labeling for that division meets regulatory standards and is consistent with guidance. And they also make sure that the labeling within that division is consistent for similar indications and products. This is a list of other core reviewers. The core reviewers include not just the primary reviewers, but the supervisors and team leaders for these reviewers. And they provide subject matter expertise and ensure that the labeling is scientifically accurate. The risk management reviewers may only be involved if the product has a REMS with a TASU, the elements to assure safe use. You've heard a little bit from Lubna about the medication error prevention analysis reviewers and what they do as well. Other subject matter experts may be included. The labeling development team, of which I'm a member of, we act as liaisons or mentors and help the associate directors of labeling to promote consistency of labeling across the divisions, whereas the ADL is within the divisions, we're across the divisions. So they ask us to get involved when we're more difficult labeling or to help them interpret some of the regulations or guidances. We develop and implement policy across CDER as well, pertinent to labeling, of course. Some of the other reviewers on this team, on this list may be involved. CDRH reviewers, for instance, may be involved for a product that's indicated for use in conjunction with a companion diagnostic. So I'm going to give you an example how we collaborate on a section of the labeling. So this is highlights again, and I've highlighted in yellow the product title. And this is a blown-up version of the product title, which includes the proprietary name, the non-proprietary name, the dosage form, route of administration, and controlled substance symbol. And this is a fictitious example of how this might look in an actual labeling. So there are several reviewers who actually participate in the review of this single one line or maybe two lines of the prescribing information and highlights. So the proprietary name, the medication error prevention analysis reviewer reviews that. That name is suggested by the applicant. The non-proprietary name, the dosage form, the pharmaceutical product quality reviewer will review this. If it's a biologic, others, biologic product reviewers will get involved as well. The route of administration will be reviewed by the clinical reviewer and the controlled substance symbol by the controlled substance reviewer. So you can see there's lots of collaboration in just this one line of highlights. At the end of the day, like I mentioned before, there are certain reviewers and CDTLs and who review the entire labeling for clinically meaningfulness and scientific accuracy as well. So now I'm going to explain how data from some sections can support recommendations in other sections. So you heard yesterday how the efficacy review is a combination of clinical and biostats. And the efficacy data is included in the clinical studies section. The clinical studies section, section 14, includes the studies that support the indicated population. So in general, we will start our review of clinical studies before we review other sections because clinical studies can inform other sections such as indications and usage and dosage administration. I'm going to exemplify that here. So here in clinical studies, the clinical reviewer and the biostats reviewer determined that efficacy is established in patients with metastatic small cell lung cancer who have progressed after receiving platinum-based chemotherapy and at least one prior line of therapy. So a very specific population. And as you can see, that same population is mirrored in the indications and usage section. Now, there may be some differences. This isn't always exactly the same, obviously. For instance, in some instances, the clinical studies that support the approval may omit geriatric patients. However, at the end of the day, the review division determines that based on the benefit-risk analysis, maybe safety information from geriatric patients, that the product can be indicated for all of adults and not just patients who are not geriatric patients. So there are differences, but generally you can see why we'd start with clinical studies before we go looking at the indication. In example 2, you can see that, again, it was determined that effectiveness was established with a dose of 20 milligrams orally once daily. And this will inform us of the dosage administration, what the recommended dose for that product is. The applicant may have submitted efficacy data for 20 milligrams and 30 milligrams, but at the end of the day, if we determine that the safe and effective dose is 20 milligrams, and that's going to be described in section 14, then that's the dose that we're going to use as a recommended dose in section 2, dosage administration. So we talked a lot about content and how we review content, and it's very important, but it's also important how we present the information. So if we have a lot of text and a very important message is stuck in the middle of a paragraph, it may be missed. We want information to be clear and concise and not be misunderstood. We spend a lot of time even with formatting things such as headings and bullets, terminology we use. We spend a tremendous amount of time, actually, in wordsmithing. So, because at the end of the day, we want the information to be clear and concise. So some of our recommendations are actually based on guidance. So if you look at, for instance, the indications and usage guidance, that guidance recommends including age groups in the indication statement. So for clarity, for indications going forward, we will include the age group in the indication statement as exemplified here, where drug X is indicated for the treatment of adult and pediatric patients 12 years of older with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. The contraindications guidance recommends using the word contraindicated when contraindicating drugs. Drug X is contraindicated in patients with condition Y. We want to use that same term because if another labeling says drug X should not be used in patients with condition Y or do not use, prescribers get confused. Does that mean something different because you use different terminology? So for contraindications, we try to use a specific terminology every time so it's very clear. The adverse reactions guidance recommends classifying adverse reactions using meaningful and specific terms. So measure terms are very helpful in classifying adverse events. However, when we translate that information to adverse reactions and place it in labeling, we want to make sure that those terms are clinically meaningful and accurate. So a term such as infestations really isn't typically clinically meaningful. We would recommend using another term. We want to, again, ensure the information is clear, concise, and applicable. So I've given you some examples here. So we want to omit information in the labeling that's not pertinent to the safe and effective use of the product for healthcare providers. So we spend a lot of time actually omitting a lot of information in the prescribing information that may be, like, say, important to patients, but not to the prescribers, because, again, prescribing information is geared towards healthcare providers. This is an example. Daily dosing and continued treatment are critical. This statement's not necessary for using the drug safely and effectively. We remove a lot of statements that may be more pertinent to the practice of medicine, but again, not to the drug use. We prefer, when possible, to use directive statements such as prepare and reconstitute drug X as described in Table 1. That's a lot more clear than you should consider preparing and reconstituting drug X as described in Table 1. So again, clarity, directive action statements. Omit clearly inapplicable content. So an example would be a product that's indicated only for use in neonates. We would recommend omitting the geriatric use subsection. Format review. So in addition to looking at the content, the PLR has a lot of format requirements. There's guidance recommendations about format too, specifically mostly for highlights, but as well as the whole prescribing information as well and content. So we do perform a format review. And I'm going to just give you an example of some of the things we might look at. So this is highlights again. And based on our regulation, the product title and initial U.S. approval must be bolded, and the initial U.S. approval must appear on the line immediately beneath the product title. So in our format review, we would actually correct that. And here you see that the product title and initial U.S. approval, are bolded and the white space is removed. The regulations also state that cross-references must be included in highlights to alert the prescriber, show the prescriber additional information about that topic. And here you can see we add the cross-references. So we develop, because there's, as I mentioned, there are many format requirements under PLR, we developed this selected requirements or prescribing information tool for format review. We call it the SERP. It's a checklist. It's available for everybody online. And we strongly encourage applicants to do a SERP checklist of their labeling before submitting it to FDA. The RPM will do a SERP review on the labeling when the application is submitted. And if there's multiple deficiencies, they may actually ask the applicant to fix those deficiencies before the team actually starts their labeling review. So what's new in the world of labeling? Well, we have some really interesting guidances that we recently published I want to briefly talk about. There's the product title and initial U.S. approval guidance. There's the draft, also another draft indications and usage guidance, and a final guidance about incorporating pediatric information in labeling. So first, the product title guidance. This guidance, the product title and initial U.S. approval, as I showed you before, are those 2 lines and highlights. And we actually developed a 39-page guidance on 2 lines. So that shows you that the information is actually more complex than you can imagine. But this guidance tells you that information, what to include in those 2 lines. And also provides information how to select the initial U.S. approval date, which actually could be a little complex, let's say for fixed dose combinations. How do you decide what date to put in there? I also want to point your attention to the product title guidance has 2 very useful appendices. One is a dosage form appendix, and the other is a route of administration appendix. The dosage form appendix, for instance, includes USP and or FDA preferred terms for dosage forms. Also includes terms that are not preferred. So if you're developing labeling, it's a very great tool to look at these appendices. The indications and usage guidance, this is a very important draft guidance that we published recently. This provides recommendations on how to develop the indications usage section of labeling, when it may be appropriate to expand the indicated population based on the clinical studies, or when it may be appropriate to narrow the indicated population. It discusses what not to include in an indication statement, such as only, like drug X is only indicated for this. It discusses when to include a limitation of use, something that a lot of folks are confused about. It also, as I mentioned before, provides recommendations about including the age group in indication statements. The pediatric labeling guidance discusses the type of information to include in 8.4, the pediatric use subsection, as well as other subsections of labeling for products under 4 scenarios: if the safe and effective use of the product has been established in pediatric patients, if the data is negative or inconclusive, if there's no data to support a pediatric indication, or if the product is contraindicated for pediatric use. So that's very useful, again, information for pediatric patients. Also, this guidance talks about including juvenile animal toxicology data and how that should be displayed in the pediatric use subsection. So finally, I'm going to focus on where to start. So this, you're developing labeling. How do I start? Where do I go? Well, FDA has some great resources that I want to alert you to about this. So one of the most important resources I want to mention is the PLR Requirements for Prescribing Information website. This is everything you always want to know about labeling, but we're afraid to ask in one area. It's got everything, most everything. It has everything about PLR, regulations. It has all of the guidances applicable to labeling. Includes all the things on this list, for instance, presentations, labeling templates, ANA labeling guidances, patient labeling resources, PLLR information. So it's a great one-stop approach, and I can tell you it's updated regularly. In fact, the person who updates this website is very fastidious, and right before I was about to come here said, "Can I put your presentation on the website?" And I said, "Please just let me give it the presentation, and you could put it on next week." So if you check this website next week, I bet you'll find my presentation. Another great resource if you're developing labeling is to look at other approved labeling. We can't stress this enough because, especially recently approved labeling. So drugs that FDA has approved FDA labeling, and if you're developing a drug, let's say you can look for products with similar indications, similar products, similar class, and see what that labeling looks like. Another great tool a lot of people are not aware of is FDA Label. FDA Label is a great search engine and has an ability to search sections of labeling and text within sections of labeling. So let's say you're developing a drug and you want to develop a warning and precaution about hepatotoxicity. You can actually put hepatotoxicity You can state the section or subsection warnings and precautions, and it'll actually, you populate all these labeling for you to look at. The only caveat about FDA label is it's based on SPL, structured product labeling. So as a result, it may not, the labeling that appears on this website may not exactly mirror approved labeling like drugs that FDA does. Finally, a word about updating labeling. Unfortunately, once your labeling is approved, that doesn't mean that labeling, the work of labeling is over with. Labeling is constantly changing. Science changes. We have new regulations such as PLLR. We have new guidances. So we encourage applicants to constantly try to update their labeling and make it a better communication tool. Labeling must be updated when the information becomes available that causes it to be inaccurate, false, or misleading. There are great opportunities to update labeling. For instance, efficacy supplements, PLLR conversions, or PLR conversion would be a good opportunity to look at the entire labeling and see what needs to be updated. So now I'm the required challenge questions. So which of the following is not a section of the prescribing information? A, full prescribing information, B, contents, C, index, D, highlights. C, correct. Good job. Okay, which of the following statements about the prescribing information is false? A, must not be misleading. B, written for healthcare providers and patients for safe and effective use of prescription drug and biological products. C, must be updated when new information causes labeling to become inaccurate. Or D, must be based whenever possible on human data. Correct, B, because the prescribing information is not written for patients, only healthcare providers. So one more thing, I hope I've sparked an interest in you in labeling, and if so, you're in luck because we have a tentative SBIA labeling conference coming soon in December, and I hope you can check the SBIA website frequently and maybe sign up and attend that presentation. And I thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Anne-Marie. And we're going to go ahead and go into some Q&A. Again, if you have questions here in the room, please come down to the microphones. Online, thank you for the questions we have so far. If you have additional questions, down in that lower right-hand corner is the Q&A pod where you can type those questions in. And let's go ahead and start with, we'll start here in the room. Can we get the handhelds on, please? Okay.
Hi. Can you talk about when a labeling supplement is morphed into an efficacy supplement, if there's not a change in indication, and how a labeling supplement gets reviewed if it includes, let's say, information from post-marketing required studies versus how an efficacy supplement might be reviewed? I just had a sponsor, an applicant, who submitted a labeling supplement and the division turned it into an efficacy supplement.
Right, so there's different types of supplements. There's CBE supplements, right? There's labeling supplements, efficacy supplements. So generally, an efficacy supplement will include clinical data that requires the team to review it a little bit differently than just, say, a labeling supplement that may be just changing and adding an adverse reaction or adding a word of precaution. If there's clinical data, clinical study, that will usually trigger it to be an efficacy supplement. Now, in the past, before PDUFA 6, that meant something as far as fees. Now, after PDUFA 6, that is not an issue about fees. But I think it's for our labeling, it's for our purposes of just knowing what type of supplement it is, getting the right people at the table for the supplement, and really that's really the difference.
All right, and again, if you have questions here in the room, please come on up to the microphones. Let's take our first online question, please.
Okay, this is about labeling negotiations. Can you comment on how to request the agency for a labeling teleconference to discuss FDA comments during labeling negotiations? My experience with different review teams have varied, with some teams more open to having dialogue and others not so much.
Right, so I think label negotiations may be a little bit different in each division and how that's handled. So one thing we try to do in our labeling reviews is to make the comments very clear to the applicant so they understand why we're making the revisions. Obviously, sometimes those comments may not be clear, and it's very important if you have questions or concerns about some of the comments or revisions to contact the RPM in charge of that application. Say, I don't understand this comment. You know, what, can we talk or speak? And yes, you can request a teleconference, or sometimes these things are done by email. The best way to interface during obviously a very stressful time, labeling negotiations at the end of the cycle, and we want to obviously get to the action of the application. So certainly in general, if you ask for that clarification, the review division will generally respond accordingly.
Okay. If there's any questions in the room, come on up to the mics, but let's go ahead and take our next online question, please.
How best should the drafting of an investigational brochure be approached prior to clinical trials, but in anticipation of an eventual NDA?
Investigational brochure. So I'm not sure how an investigational brochure relates to the approved labeling. So I'm not sure if I can understand that question.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, sometimes some of the online questions are kind of tough to fathom. Let's go ahead and take another one, please.
What do you do if you don't find a label for a drug product on drugs at FDA?
If you don't find the label, well,
I'm assuming they need in comparison.
Okay, so if drugs at FDA are approved labeling, it doesn't include all labeling. Daily Med has approved and non-approved labeling. But in general, drugs at FDA should have all approved labeling. I can't imagine why it wouldn't. So, but it should have the approved labeling.
Okay. Sometimes it's not posted, and they can also request it via FOIA, I believe.
Yes. If it's not posted, I'm sorry, that could be an issue too. So when the labeling is approved, it takes some time to get posted to drugs at FDA, and that there can be a lag time. The other thing is not all approved labeling is on drugs at FDA. Certainly new NDAs, BLAs, efficacy supplements, but if it's a minor labeling supplement change, it may not appear on drugs at FDA because we would be posting all the time.
Good. We've got a few more minutes left. If there's any questions in the room, come on up to the mics. Do we have another online question?
We do. Are there any anticipated draft or final labeling guidances that we can expect to be issued this year or the next?
I think I focused on the three main ones. Another guidance that was recently published I didn't focus on was the accelerated approval labeling guidance, which was just published this year also. That was the final guidance. I anticipate we'll probably be finalizing soon, hopefully within the next year or two, the indications and uses guidance and the product title guidance. We look forward, hopefully, to developing other guidances in the future about other subsections of labeling. I can't give you timelines, but hopefully we could work on maybe geriatric use would be a good guidance because now we have pediatric use. So, but again, I can't, those are, I think, what we've got coming right now.
Okay, another online question, please.
Sure. Can you submit a labeling change post-market supplement as a CBE 30 based on an update for additional stability information for extended reconstitution time, for example, 6 versus 12 hours, that supports the extended time?
I think that would be a very specific question. Probably would have to ask the review division. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
I see Ray and Ray New reading questions as they're coming in. Let's see if we get another one.
We have one or two where people are confused about drugs at FDA versus Daily Med versus labels.fda.gov. Drugs at FDA contains only approved labeling, so should we refer to Daily Med or labels.gov since these are also maintained through FDA? And would the versions would they have the minor labeling changes in those versions as well?
That's a very good question, and it's a very complicated issue, so I'll try to explain it. So when we approve a product, the labeling that's attached to the approval letter is in PDF, and that labeling goes to drugs at FDA. That is approved FDA labeling, except, as I mentioned, not all supplements or minor supplements are going to be posted to drugs at FDA. However, any new NDA, BLA, or efficacy supplement should be. After that drug is approved, companies have within 14 days to submit their labeling in SPL to eList, which is our big repository. Generally, within 24 hours that labeling is submitted to eList, it is populated to these websites, DailyMed and labels at FDA.gov. So we are not reviewing that labeling. It's going right from the repository directly to being posted. The other thing is that companies are allowed to make minor editorial edits and submit that labeling to the eList repository, which gets populated on these websites as well. Or CBE0 supplements, which, as you know, are supplements where there's some major safety change. At the time the applicant submits that to FDA, they also submit it to eList, and it gets populated on these websites. So FDA has not reviewed those CBE0 supplements. Once that CBE0 supplement is approved, if there's no change, then the SPL stays as is. If FDA changes that CBE, if the negotiations with the company, we change or make a change to that labeling, then that triggers an approval, which again the company will change the labeling submit new labeling in SPL that will get populated. So essentially, if you want approved labeling, drugs FDA is a place to go. If you want recent labeling, which may not be approved because it could have minor editorial edits, so CBE0 supplements, DailyMed, or labels at FDA.gov would be a good resource. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, we have a question here in the room. Nice close from the mic, please.
Yes, ma'am. Stephen Pruitt, Gap Regulatory Consulting. If I were to try to market a product as a combination product, like a kit, a convenience kit, if I were to make a claim that a dietary, or not a claim, if I were to make a statement that a dietary supplement would help ease negative side effects, two-part question, would that be a claim? And then second part of the question would be, would that product be labeled for the RX product that's in it, or would I need to present all that same information for the dietary supplement as well?
Well, I think that's a very specific question. You probably have to check with the review division on, and our next speaker about OPDP is probably going to be more versed about claims and what you can do about labeling. But I would suggest, that's probably a little bit beyond prescription drug labeling at this point.
All right. Any more online questions?
If you repurposed a drug that was approved in another country for a different indication in the U.S., do you include the adverse reaction section from the package insert in the current labeling?
So if you approve a product that was approved in Europe, yes, you need to submit, you would actually submit those adverse reactions as that occurred anywhere in the world as part of your application. And in the labeling, even though if it may be a brand new product, a brand new NDA, we would include those adverse reactions in the label. So, yes.
Okay. Got time for one more. Have we got one more online in there? I see them dig them through the online questions.
Yeah, it seems some people are still confused about the labeling databases. If FDA proposes changes to labeling submitted, companies will repopulate eList, which includes DailyMed and labels.fda.gov. Will drugs at FDA then be revised as well?
So can you repeat that again?
If FDA proposes changes to labeling submitted, companies will repopulate eList, DailyMed and labels.fda.gov. Will drugs at FDA then be revised too?
I think the basic confusion is this. FDA approves labeling, but the labeling is really owned by the applicant, the company. So we don't make any changes. The company makes the changes. So if we request a company submit a PAS supplement, we're not going to make the change to labeling. We'll ask the applicant, can you please submit a supplement to change the labeling? The applicant will submit the supplement. That supplement will be approved. And again, if it's approved labeling, it would typically go on drugs at FDA, right? Unless it's a minor change, and it may not appear that minor change on drugs at FDA. 14 days, that company would then submit to SPL. It won't show up on Daily Med until they submit SPL file, SPL to eList, and then that labeling will get disseminated on the other websites, Daily Med and labels.fda.gov. So we don't actually, FDA, make the change. We don't make labeling changes. It's the applicant who makes the changes. The only place you could see FDA-approved labeling when we approve the labeling is on drugs at FDA.
All right, and that is all the time we have for questions. As Anne-Marie mentioned, in December there is going to be much, much more coming up on labeling on a conference devoted to that. But please help me thank Anne-Marie for coming and talking to us.